Organs without bodies. Deleuze and consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Organs without bodies. Deleuze and consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Hegel 3, The minimal difference. In what, then, effectively resides the difference between Hegel and Deleuze? Perhaps the difference is not between immanence and transcendence but between flux and gap. The ultimate fact of Deleuze's transcendental empiricism is the absolute immanence of the continuous flux of pure becoming, while the ultimate fact of Hegel is the irreducible rupture of / in immanence. Here, one should evoke Einstein's passage from special to general theories of relativity. For Hegel, the gap between phenomena and their transcendent ground is a secondary effect of the absolutely immanent gap of / in the phenomena themselves. Transcendence is the illusory reflection of the fact that the immanence of phenomena is ruptured, broken, inconsistent. To put it in somewhat simplified terms, it is not that phenomena are broken, that we have multiple partial perspectives, because the transcendent thing eludes our grasp. On the contrary, the specter of this thing is the reified effect of the inconsistency of the phenomena. What if this gap in the immanence, which is not caused by any transcendence but is itself its own cause, is what Deleuze cannot accept? Therein resides Hegel's true lesson: immanence generates the specter of transcendence because it is already inconsistent in itself. This movement is best exemplified by the Christian syllogism, consisting of 3 judgments / divisions, Urteil. 1. The starting point is the experience of transcendence. One begins with positing the radical split between man and transcendent God as exemplified by the figure of Job, who finds himself perplexed by what God is doing to him. 2. In the second judgment, this split is reflected into God himself, in the guise of the split between God the Father and Christ. In the figure of Christ dying on the cross, God himself turns into an atheist, experiencing himself as abandoned by God the Father. 3. Finally, this split falls back into the split between man and man-Christ, the minimal difference separating the two. This final figure is the truth of the entire movement. What this syllogism demonstrates is how immanence is not the starting point but the conclusion. Immanence is not an immediate fact but the result that occurs when transcendence is sacrificed and falls back into immanence. Recall the well-known joke that perfectly renders the logic of the, famous Hegelian triad. 3 friends have a drink at a bar. The first one says, "A horrible thing happened to me. At my travel agency, I wanted to say a ticket to Pittsburgh, and I said a picket to Titsburg." The second one replies, "That's nothing. At breakfast, I wanted to say to my wife, could you pass me the sugar, honey, and what I said was, you dirty bitch, you ruined my entire life." The third one concludes, "Wait till you hear what happened to me. After gathering the courage all night, I decided to say to my wife at breakfast exactly what you said to yours, and I ended up saying, could you pass me the sugar, honey?" At the very bottom of despair, we thus get the most common family scene, that of the husband asking his wife for sugar. In short, the joke should be read as deploying the hidden genesis of normal, everyday family life. The immanence of normal family life is grounded in the silent despair when not only our dreams are betrayed by us but we are not even able to explode in rage against this failure. Or, to put it in Nietzschean terms, truth is not one perspective, the true one, against the other, illusory one. It only occurs in the very passage from one to another perspective. Is this not what Lacan was aiming at when, in his seminar XX, he emphasized that the discourse of the analyst emerges briefly in every passage shift from one to another discourse? René Girard made the same point apropos of the Book of Job. What makes it so subversive, in short, so true, is the very shift from one, divine, to another, Job's, perspective, along with the ultimate incompatibility of the two perspectives. Similarly, immanence only emerges as the shifting of transcendence, that is, at the moment when it suddenly strikes us how the gap that separates us from the transcendent beyond is just a fetishized misperception effect of the gap within immanence, the gap between ordinary phenomena and the phenomena in which the beyond shines through. There is a homologous triad with regard to the real, the inaccessible beyond of representations, the hard core around which our representations circulate. 1. We first posit the real as the transcendent hard kernel, always perceived in a refracted way. 2. We then accomplish the postmodern reversal: there is no need for any beyond of the transcendent real, since the play of refracted appearances is all there is. 3. The synthesis of the two positions is the return to the real, but a desubstantialized real, a real reduced to an elusive minimal difference between appearances. The real is the very cause of refraction, not the inner core beyond refraction. How are we to understand this? In the naive Marxist polemics about the knowability of the thing in itself back in the 1920s, Karl Koski argued that it is easy to arrive at the thing in itself, i.e., to establish the difference, in the perceived objects, between what is only appearance to us and what belongs to the thing in itself. We simply compare our different perceptions of the same object, and that in regard to which these perceptions differ is clearly caused by our perception, while that which remains the same must belong to the perceived thing itself. The Lacanian real inverts this scheme. While reality is what remains the same out there and is perceived by us in an always partial, distorted way, the real is the very cause of this distortion, that X on account of which our perception of reality is always distorted. The real is thus not the kernel of the same out there, inaccessible to us. Rather, it is located in the very gap that separates our perceptions, in the interstice between perceptions, as Deleuze would have put it. Recall the good old example of class struggle. There is no neutral view on class struggle, given that every notion of class struggle already implies that we took sides in the class struggle. The real of the class struggle is thus the very obstacle that prevents us from adopting a neutral perspective in relation to it. The third version of this syllogism would be that of truth itself. 1. First, truth is posited as the inaccessible beyond, something that can only be approached, something that the subject always misses. 2. Then, the accent shifts to the psychoanalytic notion of truth as intervening in the moments of slips and distortions. In the interstices of ordinary discourse, truth erupts when the continuous line of our speech gets interrupted and perturbed. 3. Finally, we arrive at a third position, that of moi, la vérité, je parle. The shift from subject to object is crucial here. It is not that what the subject says is true, it is truth itself which speaks, which turns from predicate, a qualification of subject's statements, to subject, of enunciation. It is here that truth turns into an organ without a body that starts to speak. The first two versions share the notion that truth is an inaccessible beyond. They are precisely two versions of it. Since its place is beyond, the truth never appears as such but always only in a refracted/distorted mode, or, as Lacan put it, la vérité ne peut qu'être me dire, it can only be half told. It is only in the third mode that truth as such can speak. How? In the guise of a fiction, precisely, or, to put it in another way, in the mode of the fools, or, rather, buffoons, discourse from Paul, who designated himself as a buffoon to Nietzsche. In a closer analysis, one should subdivide the second mode in two. Is the refraction/distortion the effect of the fact that the truth persists outside, as an inaccessible noumenal in itself, or are these refractions all there is, with no beyond to cause them? However, is such a position of the one through whom the truth directly speaks, or acts, not the ultimate perverse illusion? Does it not obviously rely on the existence of the big other, as in the Stalinist Marxism-Leninism, in which the party posits itself as the executor of historical necessity? This counterargument involves a crucial misunderstanding. The object that starts to speak is the object that stands for the lack/inconsistency in the big other, for the fact that the big other doesn't exist. Truth, speak does not mean that through me, the big metaphysical truth itself speaks, but means that the inconsistencies and slips of my speech directly connect to the inconsistencies and the non-all of the truth itself. Lacan's truth, speak is thus to be read together with la vérité ne peut qu'être me dire, truth can only be half spoken, elaborated in the very opening paragraph of his later television. I always speak the truth. Not the whole truth, because there's no way to say it all. Saying it all is literally impossible, words fail. Yet it's through this very impossibility that the truth holds onto the real. What this means is that the true task of thought is to think together the notion of the object which speaks and the inexistence of the big other. Truth, speak does not involve the magic overcoming of skepticism and uncertainty but involves the transposition of this uncertainty into truth itself. Christ is such an object who speaks, his words are exemplary of truth, speak that emerges at the very point of the death of big other qua God. It is here that one should overcome the position of finite subjectivity, that of we cannot ever get to know truth itself, we can only get partial glimpses of it, our knowledge is constrained by our subjective position, we cannot ever claim that the truth speaks through us. What if truth itself is non-all, affected by the real impossible of an irreducible antagonism? However, does Deleuze also not follow this path? Does he not say exactly the same thing in this key passage from the time image? What counts is the interstice between images, between two images, a spacing which means that each image is plucked from the void and falls back into it. Given one image, another image has to be chosen which will induce an interstice between the two. The interstice is primary in relation to association. The fissure has become primary, and as such grows larger. Between two actions, between two affections, between two perceptions, between two visual images, between two sound images, between the sound and the visual, make the indiscernible, that is the frontier, visible. The whole undergoes a mutation, because it has ceased to be the one being, in order to become the constitutive between two of images. Is this strategy of tracking down, not the specific difference but the minimal difference, the pure difference that differentiates an element not from other particular elements but from itself, from its own place of inscription, the minimal difference which, instead of securing the specific identity of the element in question, explodes this identity into the finite generative process of differentiation, not the very core of Hegelian dialectics, and, one may add, of the Lacanian logic of the signifier? More precisely, is this pure difference as the difference, that, in a way, precedes the two terms between which it is the difference not the very definition of the real of an antagonism? In all antagonisms, from sexual difference to class struggle, the fissure is primary as in the familiar example from Levi Strauss in which the two drawings of the map of the village come after the fissure at their interstice, each of the drawings endeavoring to cover up this fissure. When Ecobedo Lacan elaborates his fundamental opposition between the logic of difference and the logic of equivalence, he asserts the coincidence of the opposites. The two logics are not simply opposed, but each logic, brought to its extreme, converts into its opposite. That is to say, as he repeatedly points out, a system of pure differentiality, a system totally defined by the differential structure of its elements, with no antagonism and/or impossibility traversing it, would lead to a pure equivalence of all its elements. They are all equivalent with regard to the void of their outside. And, at the other extreme, a system of radical antagonism with no structure at all but just the pure opposition of us and them would coincide with the naturalized difference between us and them as the positively existing opposed species. However, from a Hegelian standpoint, the limitation of this logic is that it continues to rely on the two externally opposed poles, the fact that each of the opposites, in the abstraction from the other, i.e., brought to the extreme at which it no longer needs the other as its opposite, falls into this other, merely demonstrates their mutual reliance. What we need to do is to make a step further from this external opposition, or mutual reliance, into the direct internalized overlapping, which means, not only does one pole, when abstracted from the other and thus brought to extreme, coincide with its opposite, but also there is no primordial duality of poles in the first place, only the inherent gap of the one. Equivalence is primordially not the opposite of difference, equivalence only emerges because no system of differences can ever complete itself, it is only the structural effect of this incompleteness. In a homologous way, with regard to sexual difference, woman is not the polar opposite of man, there are women because man is not fully itself. The tension between immanence and transcendence is thus also secondary with regard to the gap within immanence itself. Transcendence is a kind of perspective illusion, the way we perceive the gap/discord that inheres to immanence itself. In the same way, the tension between the same and the other is secondary with regard to the non-coincidence of the same with itself. How, then, are these two differences related? The minimal difference between the element and its place and the difference constitutive of an antagonism. The minimal difference is the difference between the universal and the surnumerary particular which directly stands in for this universal, the paradoxical particular that, precisely insofar as it has no place within the structure of the universal, directly gives body to universality. And, how does this singular universal relate to antagonism? The only solution is a radical one. The core of an antagonism is not the conflict between the two parts/poles of a whole. Rather, it is inherent to the whole itself. It runs between the two aspects of, or modes, perspectives on, the whole, the organic structured whole containing its elements, allocating to each of them its own place in the whole, versus the whole embodied in the singular universal. It is the rift between society as the hierarchical structure and society for which the excluded, demos, the third estate, dissidents, stand. This notion of minimal difference also provides a clue regarding the infamous Lacanian disenchantment. When Lacan defines the psychoanalytic subversion not as the replacement of one, false, center with another, true, one but as the very intermediate position of a disenchantred center, of a center that does not coincide with itself, his original reference is here, of course, Kepler. The true revolution was not that of Copernicus, replacing the Earth with the Sun as the center around which planets circulate, but that of Kepler, who asserted that planets do not circulate but move in an elliptical orbit. And, what is an ellipse, if not a circle with a disenchantred/redoubled center? It is against this background that Lacan interprets the Freudian revolution. It consists not in replacing the old center, the conscious ego, with a new center, the deeper unconscious self, but in sustaining an elliptical disenchantred center. And, does the uniqueness of Christianity not reside in the fact that it involves the same paradox of the disenchantred center? Christianity is not halfway between pagan polytheism and pure Jewish, or Muslim, for that matter, monotheism. It does not add an other God to the one. Rather, it disenchants from within this one God, in the guise of the minimal difference that separates God the Father from Christ. This reinscription of the externality of a Field back into the Field itself is the truly Hegelian gesture. For Hegel, law is not simply an external totalizing force regulating the multitude of crimes/transgressions but crime's immanent self-sublation, a crime elevated to the absolute, so that the opposition of law and crime is inherent to crime itself, and not, as an incorrect Hegelianism would have us think, to the law, so that crime is reduced to a subordinate moment of the self-mediation of the law. This third position is the truly subversive one, not law as opposed to crime but law itself as the supreme form of crime. In the same way, the question to be asked is not how does the Oedipal matrix repress the free flow of the desiring machines, but, rather, what kind of a desiring machine is Oedipus? In Deleuzian terms, one should isolate, within the Field of impersonal, nomadic desiring machines, the dark precursor of the official, familial, normalizing, etc. Oedipus complex. Or, to put it in Hegelese, the Oedipus complex, in its oppositional determination, is the place at which the very force of the repression of the desiring machines encounters itself in its otherness, as one among the desiring machines. The difference between the Lacanian doublure, the inconsistency or crack in the surface of phenomenal immanence, and the Deleuzian interstice is thus that, for Deleuze, the in-between involves multitude. For Lacan, the binary tension is flattened or homogenized the moment that it is transformed into the difference of a multitude. There is something unique in the tension of an element with its uncanny double, in the minimal difference between an element and its place. The moment we pass from the single underlying antagonism to the multitude of antagonisms, we endorse the logic of non-antagonistic oneness. The proliferating multitude of antagonisms exists against the background of a neutral one as their medium, which is not itself marked or cut by an antagonism. Which is why, with regard to politics, it is crucial to privilege one antagonism over all others. The apparently innocent logic of today, we know that class struggle is not the ultimate reference of all other struggles but just one in the multitude of antagonistic struggles that characterize social life already pacify the social edifice, neutralizing the impact of antagonism. As to the idea that privileging one antagonism leads to binary logic, one should emphasize that the fact of sexual difference signals precisely the failure of binary logic, the failure of the signifying couple that would cover sexual difference. There is sexual difference because the binary signifier is primordially repressed, as Lacan put it. In other words, the antagonism of / in the one does not mean the harmonious tension between the two, opposing principles, etc., but means the inner tension, the impossibility of self-coincidence, of the one itself, or, as Alain Badiou articulates it in a concise way, atheism is, in the end, nothing other than the immanence of the two. The usual deconstructive movement is that of regressing from the domain of phi-rm identities to the contingent process of their genesis. Say, apropos all social phenomena, one strives to demonstrate how politics is not simply one of the domains, subsystems, of the global social system, since the very establishment of the demarcation line between what counts as political and what does not is a political gesture par excellence. Apolitical domains thus began to collapse like houses of cards. Market economy is political, art is political, sex and marriage are political. Is, however, philosophically, the opposite direction not much more crucial? Instead of demonstrating how there is nothing that is not political, one should rather focus on the opposed question: how is it that being itself is political? How is our ontological space structured so that nothing can escape being tainted by the political? The answer, of course, or, rather, one of the answers would be the above described structure of the gap dividing the one from within, the inherent doublure, as the most elementary ontological fact. Finally, this brings us to the topic of the subject that, according to Lacan, emerges in the interstice of the minimal difference, in the minimal gap between two signifiers. In this sense, the subject is a nothingness, a void, which exists. That is to say, already with animals, we cannot specify their unity. What makes an organism one? This unity is always ideal, since, if we analyze the body in question, we find only material parts, not what holds them together. The oneness of an organism evaporates between our fingers. These paradoxes were already explored in detail by Hegel in the second chapter of the Phenomenology on Perception, or, the Thing and Deception. In this sense, one is the name of the void. With the emergence of subjectivity, this void is posited as such. It becomes for itself, and the empty signifier, the mark of this void, represents the subject for other signifiers. Therein resides the passage from Hume to Kant, whereas Hume endeavors to demonstrate how there is no self. When we look into ourselves, we only encounter particular ideas, impressions, etc., but no self as such. Kant claims that this void is the self. This, then, is what Deleuze seems to get wrong in his reduction of the subject to, just another, substance. Far from belonging to the level of actualization, of distinct entities in the order of constituted reality, the dimension of the subject designates the re-emergence of the virtual within the order of actuality. Subject names the unique space of the explosion of virtuality within constituted reality. According to the logic of sense, sense is the immaterial flow of pure becoming, and subject designates not the substantial entity whose predicate, attribute, property, capacity, is the sense event, but a kind of anti-substance, a negative/inverted substance, the immaterial, singular, purely abstract point that sustains the flow of sense. This is why the subject is not a person. To put it in Deleuzian terms, person belongs to the order of actualized reality, designating the wealth of positive features and properties that characterize an individual, whereas the subject is divided precisely in the Deleuzian sense of individual as opposed to individual. Usually, personalists insist on the unique character of each individual as a combinatoire of features that cannot ever be repeated and that are organically woven together through an underlying, unidentifiable je sais quoi as the mystery of personality. The subject is, on the contrary, endlessly repeatable or divisible. It is nothing but the unending process of division/repetition. Subject thus relates to substance exactly like becoming versus being. Subject is the absolute unrest of becoming, absolute Unruhe de Werdens, i.e., a state of things conceived from the perspective of its genesis. It was already Fichte, to whom Deleuze himself refers, who conceived the subject as pure. Self-positing activity. Activity is not a predicate/attribute of the subject precisely because the subject is only, exists exclusively as, the activity of its own self-positing. In other words, the subject is a purely virtual entity in the strict Deleuzian sense of the term. The moment it is actualized, it changes into substance. To put it in yet another way, subjectivity is the site of true infinity. No wonder, then, that when Deleuze asserts the infinity of pure becoming as the virtuality that encompasses every actualization, he is again secretly Hegelian. Recall, in Hegel's logic, the difference of the quantitative, spurious, and the qualitative, true, infinite. The first infinity resides in the act of going beyond, of traversing the finite, while the finite in itself, as the objective result, is a sterile repetition of the same. What is infinite in it is the very act of going beyond. We have here the opposition of becoming and being, of act and result. If we look at the results, there is no infinite. Infinite is just the subjective urge to go beyond, the creative in-between of the two repetitions. Is this not a topic we encounter from art to politics? The fixed result always betrays us. What matters is the movement. Recall the famous episode from Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon, the most succinct formula of permanent revolution. Sam Spade narrates the story of his being hired to locate a man who had suddenly left his settled job and family and vanished. Spade was unable to track him down. But, a few years later, he ran into the man in a bar in another city, where he lived under an assumed name, leading a life remarkably similar to the one he had fled when a beam from a construction site narrowly missed his head. After sharing a drink, the man tells him that, although he now leads the same life, his disappearance and his new beginning were not in vain. Is this repetition also not a model of minimal difference? In the repetition of the same, the minimum of the subjective excess emerges. Or, to make the same point in yet another way, this minimal difference is not a difference at the level of the enunciated content but a difference at the level of the tension between enunciated and enunciation. The very no difference at all at the level of the enunciated content confronts us with the pure difference between enunciated and enunciation. Lillian Hellman wrote, apropos of her turbulent relationship with the same Hammett, in the early years, I would say, tell me more about the girl in San Francisco. The silly one who lived across the hall in Pine Street. And he would laugh and say, she lived across the hall in Pine Street and was silly. Here, again, we encounter the difference between enunciation and enunciated content, at its purest. At the level of the enunciated, Hammett's repetition does not add anything while, at the level of enunciation, of his subjective position from which he speaks, his answer is telltale, since it displays a stance of resigned, ironic self-detachment. In short, through the very fact that we do not learn more about the girl who lived across the hall in Pine Street and was silly, we learn quite a lot about Hammett himself. In contrast to it, the true infinite offers the inverse paradox. The finite activity's outcome is an infinite result. Recall the Hegelian topic of state as the infinite social substance, thousands of finite wills working and struggling, with the result being the self-relating infinite of the state. We find here again the political tension between celebrating the infinite subversive movement and focusing on the result. And, the same goes for Christ himself. It is not that his death, finitude, at the level of the enunciated content asserts the infinity, eternity, of his position of enunciation, but, on the contrary, that his subjectively assumed finitude, the finitude of his position of enunciation, gives birth to the infinite collective of the Holy Ghost. So, why this exceptional, strangely reductionist misreading of Hegel on Deleuze's part, a misreading where the point is not, as is the rule in Deleuze's great interpretations, to write about an author in the famous free indirect style in order for Deleuze himself to use the interpreted author as his interceptor and speak, articulate his own innermost position, through him. Instead of such a violent productive reappropriation, what we get, in the case of Hegel, and the Oedipus complex, is a flat, totally homogeneous image of the enemy, with whom we are confronted in a clear face-to-face of our versus his position, each of us fully speaking in his own name, with no free indirect style voices confusing the unambiguous picture. Perhaps the answer is designated by Jameson's perspicuous observation on how Deleuze strive toward unconditional monism. Is paradoxically the source of the later dualisms. For the principle of desire itself would be a monism, everything is libidinal investment, everything is desire, there is nothing which is not desire, nothing outside desire. This means, of course, that fascism is a desire. That bureaucracy is desire, the state is desire, capitalism preeminently desire, even the much maligned Oedipus complex has to correspond to a certain desire in order to take on its inveterate authority. If the mission of the one lies in subordinating illusory pairs, doubles, oppositions of all kinds, then it turns out that we are still in dualism, for the task is conceived as the working through of the opposition, the dualism between dualism and monism. Where, then, do we encounter dualism here? The answer is provided by the strange complementarity of the relationship between Deleuze and Foucault. The tension between Deleuze and Foucault sometimes appears to have the structure of a mutual implication. At the extreme point of his development marked by discipline and punish, as well as the First volume of History of Sexuality, Foucault conceived of the emancipation/liberation from power as totally inherent to power itself. Since power generates the very resistance to itself, the subject that strives to liberate itself from these clutches of power is already a product of power, of its disciplinary and controlling mechanisms. For instance, the very repressive mechanism that regulates our sexual lives generates sex as the excess, the dark continent, that needs to be regulated. In a strictly symmetrical way, Deleuze, in Anti-Oedipus, at least, conceives of the force of repression as inherent to desire. In a kind of Nietzschean genealogy, Deleuze and Guattari endeavor to explain, from the very imminent deployment of desire, the reactive, life-negating attitude of lack and renunciation. In both cases, the structure is that of the absolute immanence of the two opposed poles. The circle is thus closed, except only from the opposite direction, as it were. To put it in Hegelian terms, in Foucault, power is the encompassing unity of itself and its opposite, i.e., the resistance to itself, whereas, in Deleuze, desire is the encompassing unity of itself and its repression, i.e., its negating force. Of course, the crucial question here is, are these two operations fully symmetrical, or is there a hidden dissymmetry between the two? It is here that one should follow the Hegelian path. The question is that of the encompassing subject of the process. For Deleuze, the acephalous, anonymous, impersonal subject is desire itself, which encompasses/generates its opposite, repression, whereas, for Foucault, the, again, acephalous, anonymous, impersonal subject is power, which encompasses/generates its opposite, resistance. And the Hegelian gesture here is precisely to explode from within the unity of this presupposed, encompassing subject, the subject passes into its predicate. In other words, at the beginning of the process, desire generates the structure of power, which then, retroactively, poses itself as the process subject. This is what Hegel calls the speculative passage of subject into predicate. In other words, Hegel is here a kind of dialectical synthesis of the opposite positions of Deleuze and Foucault, that is, their speculative identity. It is only such a monism of the process itself with the constant displacement of its subject that effectively allows us to overcome dualism. As long as we stick to one subject, a dualism has to return as the very inherent result of our monism. The paradox here is, of course, that what we are reproaching Deleuze with is that, in missing this Hegelian point, he is not Deleuzian enough. The drift of his monism into dualism bears witness to the fact that his process of becoming is itself secretly anchored in a unified subject. When Deleuze opposes being and becoming, when he insists on how becoming is not a becoming of a being as an established entity but a process that itself establishes being, and transforms them, does he not thereby point toward the Hegelian speculative judgment as a process in the course of which subject and predicate exchange places, so that the process is not the process of a subject, but generates new subjects of itself, involving shifts from one to another subjectivity? Is, then, from this Hegelian perspective, what Deleuze attacks as Hegelianism not precisely subject as, still, substance, the self-identical foundation/ground of a process, and not yet the empty, non-substantial subject? What this means is that the topic of subject insists, it eludes the opposition of impersonal intensities and positive self-identical entities. The late Foucault sensed this when he reasserted the topic of subjectivity. However, even if there is a grain of truth in the reproach of Deleuze's dualism, and in the remark that the opposition, between nomadic and state, molecular and molar, and so forth is not simply the opposition between the good, nomadic, and the evil, state, Deleuze is as far as possible from asserting any kind of complementarity between the two poles, in the sense that, while the molar state alone is oppressive, suffocating the flow of desire, the opposite extreme, as the total abolition of the state, would mean regression into the psychotic, self-destructive rage of the pure, pre-Oedipal flow of desire. So, what we ostensibly need is the right balance between the two. This is how, among others, Julia Kristeva reads and appropriates Deleuze, while praising his liberation of the creativity of desire from the constraints of state power. She nonetheless warns of the destructive consequences of seeing in the state only a negative barrier to be abolished. To avoid direct self-destruction, the total revolutionary abolition of the existing state always reverts into a new order, even more oppressive than the previous one. In this sense, Kristeva praises revolt, the liberation of the wild pre-Oedipal creative forces, the liberation that is not primarily political but more intimate, psychic, religious, artistic, and condemns revolution as the installation of a new order, the coagulation of the creative energies of the revolt. From a truly Hegelian, Deleuzian, and/or Lacanian approach, a strange series of equivalences indeed, this line of argumentation should be rejected in toto. True radically does not consist in going to the extreme and destroying the system, i.e., in disturbing too much the balance that sustains it, but consists in changing the very coordinates that defy any this balance. Say, once we accept the social democratic idea of the modern capitalist market economy cum welfare state, it is easy to claim that one should avoid both extremes, i.e., the total freedom of the market, on one hand, and excessive state intervention, on the other hand, and find the right balance between the two. However, the true revolution would consist in transforming the very overall balance of the social edifice, in enforcing a new structural principle of social life that would render the very field of the opposition between market and state obsolete. Or, let us take the platitude about the right balance between the permissive indulgence of spontaneity and the rigors of discipline. Revolution is not the assertion of spontaneity and rejection of every discipline but the radical redefinition of what counts as true spontaneity or discipline. For instance, in the Kantian philosophical revolution, true, transcendental, spontaneity occurs not when I follow my natural instincts and needs but when I exercise my freedom, which means when I act against my spontaneous natural impulses. There is a wonderful detail in Superman 3, the movie. Angry at the world, Superman, momentarily turned evil, flies to Pisa and straightens up the Leaning Tower. And, effectively, What makes Pisa interesting? It is the stupid fact that the tower is somehow out of joint, that it does not stand straight. The worst thing one can do to it is to set it straight. This act throws the town of Pisa back into indifference, depriving it of its sign of recognition. The lesson of this story is universal and contains fundamental ontological consequences. For something to exist, it has to rely on something that stands out, that disturbs the balance. As quantum cosmology has taught us, the universe emerged out of the void, ex nihilo, through a disturbance/disruption of balance.